Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette, and we're so glad you're with us to stay curious today. Today, May 18th, 2022, is a wonderful day in space history, as 53 years ago today, man was embarking on the full dress rehearsal for a lunar landing. And I was just a teenage boy at the time, and so exciting to think back and relive the excitement of 53 years ago where we were going to the moon again. Of course, we went with Apollo 8 in November 1968, but we were going with the Lunar Module. Though it wasn't going to land, it was going to go within 9 miles of the lunar surface, testing everything but the final 10 steps to land on the moon. It was an exciting time as all of years growing up, if you grew up in that period and are a baby boomer, 5, 6 years of constantly in the news, the moon race with Soviet Union, the Gemini space flights, Russia finally lagging behind. Their moon rocket wouldn't work like our Saturn V rocket here always did. And then finally, right before the summer of 1969, we're last days of school, we're launching to go to the moon with Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan. All were veteran astronauts, well known in the public eye at the time. And only Apollo 11 had an all veteran crew also. Those two crews were all veteran crews, the only Apollo missions to fly three all veterans. That's how important these missions were and how dedicated these former test pilots were to making sure that we fulfilled President Kennedy's declaration in 1961 that we're going to go to the moon before the end of the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard and was going to make America great. And it did. And still, we've not been back since December 1972. We're hoping to go back with the Artemis program. But today we're talking about space history like none other, barnstorming the moon in a spacecraft called Snoopy. All right, and we'll get into that a little bit of why it's called Snoopy. But Marty Winkle, my cameraman, co-producer, he and I are both grateful that Hyatt Place sponsors our Stay Curious studios inside the American Space Museum in downtown Titusville. Marty, the windows were rattling a little bit around town here about 6:30 this morning as another SpaceX rocket was launched off with 53 satellites. And there's a buzz around town because tomorrow afternoon we're going to launch a intended to be crewed spacecraft, but it'll be uncrewed. Of course, the Starliner of Boeing is going to ride to space on an Atlas V rocket, and that's about a 6:54, I think, is the launch time tomorrow evening. So we'll have Spaceview Park filled up with a bunch of rocket hobos, and the coast will be filled with everyone wanting to watch that on a Thursday evening. And Hyatt Place is a great place to watch it from their fifth floor observation deck up there. Mark Usiak, one of our friends of the museum, took this panoramic image and then dummied in a rocket launch going off the Cape there. Don't think you'd have that contrail unless you have an SRB. I mean, a solid rocket booster there. But anyway, Hyatt Place, thank you for all you do for the American Space Museum. Well, Marty drew my attention that 112 years ago, Marty remembers looking outside and seeing Halley's Comet as big as a horse's tail. 112 years ago, right, Marty?
Oh, yeah.
You remember that at your grandma's farm, right, on Long Island. Well, of course, Mr. Winkle's not that old, but nobody's that old anymore to remember this. But Halley's Comet, the most famous of all comets, made a very close approach in 1910. I saw it in 1986. Every 76 years it comes around. So I forget the math there. 2032, I think, is when it's intended to come back around. So I'll be missing that one. But it was huge. In 1986, it wasn't that close to Earth. It was like we're looking at it from the other side of our orbit. In 1910, it was almost following beside the Earth in its orbit. And in fact, Earth was going to pass through the tail of Halley's Comet that stretches out for millions of miles. And boy, I'm telling you, people were going crazy thinking The coming end of the world. Halley's Comet may snuff out life on Earth, Marty, were headlines all over in newspapers because they were theorizing that Halley's Comet had something in it that would ignite the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere and cause the whole world to burn up. That was one of the theories in there. Of course, this tail of a comet actually has two tails. One is debris that is blown off by the solar wind, and another is gases that are blown in a different direction by the solar wind, taking a different arc off of the comet. So comets definitely are intruders in our solar system, and they contain maybe the birth DNA of life, definitely filled with a lot of water. And we now know today that what's coming off of them is like streaming debris and gases off of it. But interesting to think, the coming end of the world. I mean, there's Halley Comet pills. People thought they would get sick. All kinds of conjecture. 112 years ago, all right, as the Earth passed through Halley's Comet tail. Now, Halley's Comet was going to be visible for a couple months. And as it got closer to the sun, it actually got brighter and bigger. Anyway, fun to share that piece of space history, but we want to talk all about looking at the moon from 9 miles away for the very first time. And so primitive was education or communication back then. Here is the concept of the Grumman Lunar Module, okay, with a circular hatch, 4 windows there, contours on it. That was quickly changed as we realized that this spacecraft to be flown in outer space by humans standing up for weight to save weight. This was the concept that was going to be on their lunar module. And here is an actual model of that that's about 3 feet, about 2.5 feet tall. That's here in our museum. One of our treasures here that we love came from Grumman. Somehow we got this. From 1962 is this concept of the lunar module that many of you seen on display, maybe photographed. And here is President Kennedy in front of another mock-up of a Grumman lunar module. This was in about the same time that this one was cobbled together. Actually, that's a wood model, by the way. Here is one of the other concepts of it, more of a helicopter style windows at the top up there. And there is President Kennedy speaking at, not exactly sure if that's Beth Page, Marty. I forget what that cut line said, but Vice President Johnson's there. Right behind Kennedy is James Webb. That's Mr. Gilruth, the bald guy on the right. That was another idea. See the antenna coming off of it and the high gain antennas. And sorry for the pixelation here, but there is the genesis of the lunar module from 1962. Then they got rid of the 5 legs and made it 4. Then they got rid of the circular hatch and made it a rectangular to fit the personal life support system, the backpack that kept the astronauts alive on the moon. And then we see the final concept here. Again, sorry for the pixelated out there picture. I don't know if making me different, Marty, shows that a little bit better. There is the guts inside the schematic of the Grumman. They had 2 different motors. One was a motor that would land it, okay, and then the landing platform would become the landing platform for it. And this ascent stage had a very simple hypergolic engine in it. Hypergolic fuels. Hypergolic means they don't need an igniter. When they touch each other, they turn into an explosion that they control. And those are some nasty materials they use because we've talked about them on Stay Curious with the Grummies that we've had on here, including Marty and 4 or 5 of his Grumman friends that worked on this. I failed to mention that Marty Winkle did work on this, my co-producer here at Kennedy Space Center through the entire program. And to me, it's just an amazing machine. I'm going to read a few things about it here as we talk about it. The cramped lunar module cockpit had the seats ripped out to save weight. Here is a cool picture of it. Is that in the high bay at the ONC, Marty, or that wouldn't be at Grumman, would it? That'd be here.
Looks like it's a low bay.
Okay. Technically the low bay, but it's here at Kennedy Space Center. We're looking around in these pictures trying to find Marty in them, but I'd like to show you what is inside this, because this is what the one astronaut in particular, Fred Hayes, knew this inside and out, and that was to their advantage on the Apollo 13 rescue mission, because he knew where everything was. But the back end, there's batteries, and you've got the white big ball there is either your oxygen or your gases for the descent stage. They call that the cheeks, is when you look at it covered up. And there's a tiny little, about the size of a basketball in there, where they put oxygen for the astronauts in there. The triangular windows cut weight, imperfecting the use of manufacturing techniques unheard of in the 1960s, such as chemical milling. Grumman helped reduce the LEM's weight. This chemical milling, Marty and his friends have talked about, where they literally shaved off layers of metal. What went in the LEM crew cabin was built with an aluminum alloy, the thickness of 3 sheets of kitchen aluminum foil. The cabin, propellant tanks, the reaction control, and environmental control systems, none of this suffered any mission-threatening leaks on any of the LEM's 2 orbital test flights and 6 moon landings, and of course 1 infamous rescue on Apollo 13. So, what I find interesting, Marty, is about this lunar module. Look at a couple other pictures of it. I'm sorry, that is so pixelated out. I think I'm grabbing a pretty good image, and I apologize when I don't. But, the chief engineer was Thomas Kelly, and he was considered the father of the lunar module. And he wrote a book called Moonlander in 2001. And quoting him, he said, "Our proposed design already had gone a long way towards simplicity. It was helium pressure fed, no pumps, hypergolic fuels, which required no igniters, ablatively cooled, no intricate liquid cooling passages, okay, and operated a single fixed level of thrust, simple controls. Minimizing the amount of plumbing, components, and joints was also a virtue because it reduced the chance of leakage, which, due to the small margins in the amount of propellant required to achieve lunar orbit from the moon's surface, could be disastrous." So everything was weighed, and everything was so weight restrictive on there. The joints were welded with gold, okay, and all kinds of new techniques. And what I find interesting, Marty, talking to your grummy friends, is you would have let's say you had a piece that let's say there's a 5-inch tube that had to be welded into a place, okay? You would have 5 or 6 5-inch tubes to pick from, right, Marty? You would have a whole table full, and you would that had already been tested. You'd have 5 or 6 there. You only need 1. But you'd have 5 or 6 there to choose from arbitrarily that had already been tested. So you had plenty of materials there. The inside the lunar module, of course, we talked about the triangular wings there. This is a familiar scene to Marty because as the lead electrical engineer, he was inside all ascent stages. Even some of them, he told me when he was on top of the Saturn V was out at the pad in the covering that they call the slaw, which was Saturn Launch Adapter. Is that what that meant? SLA, SLA. This is one of the best photos I could find of the interior. Very hard to find good pictures in the interior of the lunar module for some reason. If you find them, they're copyrighted, and I don't know why. They're government property. But there is the one that is inside this is at the Smithsonian, all right? and the desky computer is not in the middle of this, you might notice. But there's a triangular windows. You had the 3 sheets of tinfoil that was the outer area, but you had panels everywhere in there. So Marty, I bet that brings back memories of standing there. But that's the is that the door right there? I don't clearly see the door in the middle there. Okay, that's the door with the you got the circle there. That's the opening of the door right there. Okay, that's the door that they would go down into the lower bay. Behind you is the hump of the ascent stage engine, much like a Volkswagen bus engine was a hump in those things, if any of you baby boomers drove around, and maybe you're driving one today. But very cramped, and they had to stand up. The only crewed spacecraft designed for the crew persons. And of course, they were all men in Apollo. Just they had to stand up. What's that bar in the middle? Is that just like a handhold to balance them? Had no other function but kind of like on a subway, and you're up there grabbing yourself to handhold it, huh?
Like that one?
And there's one there, okay. And they had one over there to hold on to, and those were grips there in case they rocked it in hard there. I remember one of the first pressure tests I read about, the windows popped out. But that's why they pressure tested everything ahead of time. Here, though, we look long and hard for pictures of Marty in his Grumman days, and I think I found one. That's got to be your right foot going through the tunnel there. Not the tunnel, going through the hatch there, Marty. Is that your foot or not? Put an arrow on that. Show people what we're talking about there. But this is Lunar Module 6. They all had a tail number. LM6 was Apollo 13. There's what I'm teasing Marty about. That could be him. And we have the astronaut pilot team there. These were Grumman-trained Lunar Module pilots. We just lost Scotty McLeod. He was the chief of all of them for a while there. And we lost Scotty about a year ago and at age 94. And he had wonderful stories of working. He was a CBS commentator during the lunar landings with Walter Cronkite. But very rare picture. I had never seen this one before, Marty. But hopefully that brings back memories to you. But you would have to crawl in the hatch, right? That's the only way to get in there. You would never go through the docking tunnel at the top, right? So, and there was all kinds of structures and stuff inside, so you wouldn't mess up anything, I imagine. But the floor wasn't the real floor on the moon.
GSE floor.
It was what?
GSE, ground support equipment.
Ground support equipment. Because something that I keep forgetting about, when you look at the how this is built, it's not built to support people in Earth gravity. It's built to support 1/6 gravity. So the ladder that we're all familiar with, the ladder that they walk down on the lunar leg, you never would go up and down that because it would break here on Earth. It was designed to only be used at 1/8 gravity, at 1/6 gravity. So there had to be a trainer that they had to walk down to learn how to do it. But the real articles everything was so designed to be 1/6 gravity. So if you weigh 100 pounds on Earth here, you weigh about 30 on the moon type of thing. Something like that. Someone will correct me with the math on that. And we do appreciate Ophelia watching today. Mark and Tom Usiak in Pennsylvania. Ashley Kendrick, thank you for watching in Tennessee. We know Dave Stengy's there and Larry Pushkar. They are, did you see the big salary we gave our coach at Ohio State? We have to kid each other because I'm from Ohio. But, well, let's see, who else has been watching it? Robert Law, of course. Thank you for watching in Dundee, Scotland, Robert. Well, let's carry on here. There's all the Grumman workers, some of them. There's over 1,500 of them here on the Kennedy Space Center. So this is one of the shifts there outside. We were trying to find Marty in that. You kind of think that you remember that photo call, but again, wearing not actually a bunny suit per se, but you wore white smocks with headgear most of the time, right, Marty?
Yeah, but if you went in the vehicle or inside the slot, you had a bunny suit.
Okay, so you did have a bunny suit. How did those bunny suits change from the Apollo era to the shuttle era? They didn't. Not. I was wondering if there was a
In
manufacturing.
the early part of the shuttle. Later on, maybe it did. I don't know.
Uh huh. Okay. All right. We love talking. He was also a shuttle guy. Here is the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous that I failed to notice, of course, is behind me. You all noticed that behind me. There's two ways we could go to the moon. Direct was launched from the Earth and go directly to the moon and land and come back in the same spacecraft. That was going to require a lot of fuel. And then there was the Earth Orbit Rendezvous, where we would go to Earth orbit with both the Saturn V rocket would take up both vehicles, and one would stay in Earth orbit, the mothership, while the lunar module by itself would make the trip to the moon, probably with some power assist. But then what they settled for was the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. This was pioneered by a physicist named Hobart. That he had to convince Werner von Braun didn't want to do it that way. He was in favor of the Earth Orbit Rendezvous with bigger rockets. But they decided to take everything and put it in Earth orbit, put the mothership, moon orbit, put lunar orbiter in orbit, and the command module was the mothership. The lunar module would be a disposable spacecraft, because when it came back and redocked, okay, it did not have the base on it, all right, and they would transfer the rocks and everything to it, photos, of course, and then they would abandon it, and they usually fired the engine to crash it into the moon, so those seismic instruments could record an impact. But we're going to talk about in a minute, Apollo 10, they left it in lunar orbit, and in fact, they fired it away from the moon to go into solar orbit, and we may bring it back one day. I'll tell you about that in a second here. But let's get the boys to the moon, and first we got to get the big Saturn V rocket out of the VAB. What a gorgeous photograph, Marty. I love old-timey photos like that. There's the vehicle assembly building. This 365-foot tall structure crawling along there, just like the Artemis rocket did a couple months ago. And those that small building right there I'm pointing to with the windows, that is the launch control.
Right behind you.
Yep. And that's the launch control building there, right behind me there. And so I love these shots. This is a very famous photograph, and of Tom Stafford petting, so to speak, a Snoopy doll, and that is Jamie Flowers. And she was a friend of the museum. Karen knew her real well. Our wonderful supporter, Hazel Seacack Banks. Hi, Hazel. She's been in Europe for 3 weeks, Marty, and I think she's caught a few Stay Curious. Don't go over and rob her house now, okay? I'm not going to tell you where she lives. But she's been enjoying a European vacation. That is Tom Stafford, who's 91 years old, petting the Snoopy. Why Snoopy? Because that was the name of the lunar module. That was the call sign. And the call sign for the command module was Charlie Brown, all right? So starting with Apollo 9, when the lunar module was finally ready with Apollo 9, it wasn't ready by Apollo 8. That's why it went to the moon with just the command module and service module. Well, if they finally tested Apollo 9 in Earth orbit, better safe than sorry, get it 200 miles up. If we got a problem, we can get them astronauts back quickly instead of doing the initial shakedown around the moon of the lunar module. Everything went well on Apollo 9. They the call sign of the lander was a spider, because it looks like a spider, obviously, all right? Let me put this spider together here. Spider was the lunar module, and the command module was called Gumdrop, all right? Not too creative for that Apollo 9 guys, but they got the job done. But they needed to say, they couldn't say Apollo 9, how you doing, when the two vehicles were separated. They had to know which one they were talking to, so you need different call signs. And so Tom Stafford is a fun guy. He's, of course, a very serious test pilot, but likes to have a lot of fun. And he was a friend of Charles Schultz and liked Peanuts comic strip, and asked him if we could use Peanuts and Charlie Brown. And so they did. And very famous picture here. I wonder if Jamie still has that Snoopy doll. It would be worth $1,000, Marty, in our auctions, I guarantee it. But there's Snoopy. He become the mascot of safety for the Apollo program and on through the shuttle. Okay, eyes on the stars, Snoopy doing his thing. And some of the outstanding performers at NASA and the contractors, Marty tells me about 1% of the workforce would get a Snoopy award. This is very small, less than an inch in diameter, and you'd be recommended by your management boss, and then an astronaut would recommend you for doing something great. And so the coveted Snoopy award lives on. I don't know if they're going to do that through Artemis or not, Marty, but they certainly did the Snoopy award through the Shuttle Era. But here is the blast off of Apollo 10 going to the moon. Kind of another odd picture. I love showing you pictures that you normally don't see on our Stay Curious podcast here. The cloud of the exhaust is obscuring the engines firing off there, and that is RP kerosene with liquid oxygen fueling it. And once it got to orbit, John Young was the command module pilot. The great John Young grew up in Orlando, and we have a parkway named after him, just 50 miles from our museum. And so he stayed in orbit for 3 days, they were separated 8 hours when they separated, okay? And we got to throw Charlie Brown in there in his spacesuit. Can't leave old Charlie out. He's got the emblem on his little spacesuit recycler there. But what got them there, and what was the important piece of hardware back in the day, is this, called the DSKY, or DESKY. This is a computer. As you see, it had verb, noun, enter, reset, and then you would hit a verb and hit numbers, and the numbers had different meanings, okay? And P meant program, clear, forward, enter. This was a whole whopping 64 kilobytes of computer memory. That's right. Some of you under 40 don't even know what a kilobyte is. But it was 1,000 kilobytes is a megabyte. So you probably know what that is. This is so simple, and they wanted it to be simple. And we miss Bob Pearson, who was an MIT trainer. MIT did the program, and Bob Pearson, who passed away about 2 years ago, was a simulator trainer. And the simulator in the flight crew training building had 1 lunar module and 2 command modules. And these were kept very busy with the astronauts learning how to land in the largest video game in the world. It was a video of the lunar surface, and whatever they did, the video would react to where they were on the moon. Quite a sophisticated thing. But the program was put together. Does this look familiar to you, Marty? The old green computer paper there that people would buy like crazy. But this is how the data was researched and looked at, all right, back in the day, back in 53 years ago.
The shuttle also.
Oh, the Shuttle Era also had the green computer paper there on the edges. This was the profile, and this is basically what Apollo 10 did to the landing phase, all right? They tilted over to take pictures of the landing site at about 9,600 feet. All right, but they didn't go hardly any further, and I'm unclear how much they tilted the spacecraft around, because when it came in to slow down, the thruster, of course, is at their point of direction to slow them down, and that was a program called P63, and then they push in P64 in that DESKY computer there, hit the number 64, and it would flip them over to get their first view of their landing site, okay? And then they would look and see where they were, but the Apollo 10 didn't go that far. They were basically testing the range to get effective data. The objectives included an 8-hour lunar orbit of the separated two vehicles, about 9 miles off the moon's surface, and then they descended down for then they ascended for rendezvous and docking with the command and service module in a 70-mile orbit, and then they stayed for another day or two there. Pertinent data to be gathered in this landing rehearsal dealt with the lunar potential or gravitational effect to refine Earth-based crewed flight techniques. That's important. Talking to the ground, checking the trajectories, the radar, lunar flight control systems. Would all of this work? We orbited the Earth 70 miles high in November, actually December, Christmas Eve, 1968. All right. So 6 months earlier, we had orbited the moon, but we never got closer than 70 miles. So now they're really getting down among them, and they also want to take photographs of the Mare Tranquility area that the proposed Apollo 11 landing was going to make. So all mission objectives were achieved, okay, but it wasn't without drama. And where's my before I get into that drama, let me show you the landing sequence here. Now we can tell that this is the Lunar Module orbiting the moon, LM4, and not the Earth. And Marty knows how I can tell that this is not Luna 9, and that's not the Earth in the upper corner, because it only has 3 probes sticking off the pads. The probe on the left is over the ladder, and they took that off on the lunar flights. Apollo 9 does have that probe on it, and they took it off because they didn't. Those probes actually touch down, a blue light comes on, and that's when you hear the astronauts say contact light. And then they're supposed to cut the engine off and drop that last 5 feet. None of the astronauts did because they were test pilots and weren't going to turn the engine off till they felt like they were on the ground. But there was a shock absorbing system in there that was to collapse. And Neil Armstrong made such a soft landing that is actually hard for them to jump up to the first rung on the surface or get off of that first rung because there wasn't any collapse of the shock absorber system. So, but if you want to learn all about this lunar landing, the computer stuff, this is a great book by Don Eilis. Don Eilis wrote this book, Sunburst and Luminary. Sunburst is the program for the command module. Luminary is what the Massachusetts Institute of Technology brainiacs that put this together, that's what they called their program to land on the moon. There again is the most important piece of hardware, or the software. I should say, Marty, that's the only piece of software on this vehicle. Okay. And there is Snoopy approaching the Charlie Brown without the landing legs on it. And once again, when they made it back, they discarded it into solar orbit. And there are the astronauts. Got to show a picture of them. That's Gene Cernan on the left, who's passed away, and he was the commander of the last moonwalk, Apollo 17 in December 72. We're going to be celebrating that 50 years here coming up the end of the year. John Young in the middle, and John, we lost him a couple years ago at age 86. And there's the general, Tom Stafford, who I've had the privilege to talk to a couple times, and he's been a big help to our museum. Tom just auctioned, he was the commander for Apollo Soyuz test project also. He passed up a moon landing, Marty. Not sure why that didn't pan out for him. He certainly could have been a commander for a moon landing, but I don't know why. Do you? It'd be interesting to know. This was an all-experienced crew. They were all Gemini astronauts, as were the Apollo 11 crew. And then we flew about 3 of the other missions with one veteran and 2 rookies, but you could call Apollo 14 was 3 rookies because Alan Shepard, the commander, only had 15 minutes of suborbital flight, 5 of that weightless. So keep mentioning that Snoopy is orbiting the sun, and they think some satellite trackers think they found it and have locked into it, and it's supposed to make a pass by Earth in a couple years. And there is hope that somebody like Elon Musk of SpaceX or Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin or somebody else might want to capture it and for posterity, and it'd be easy to do. You could attach something to go to this docking port, and even if the docking port wouldn't work exactly the way it did in the Apollo days, you could rig something to capture it and haul it back down to the space station, or one of those space stations that Axiom's going to build for your next vacation orbiting the Earth. Anyway, we are going back to the moon, Marty, with Artemis. It's exciting stuff. By the way, just to show you, we can track things that are orbiting the Earth, the sun that we put in space. This is the Apollo 10 third stage, the Saturn 4B that is shown there. And they think that the 17-foot wide lunar module might be 14 feet wide. The lunar module would be detected like this, but they are tracking it. We are going back to the moon one day, to the South Pole, because there's water from maybe comets down there. And when we do go back to the moon, will it look like this? That kind of looks like Elon Musk's Starship, but if you look real close, that is a proposal for a Gemini spacecraft to land on the moon back in the 1960s. As you can see, the astronaut using a winch basically to get down to the lunar surface. And we have conjectured on that Starship several things. How are the astronauts going to get down to the surface? Because it looks to be over 150 feet tall. Certainly over 100 feet tall. They have an elevator inside or whatever. But this is the Gemini concept in the 1960s, to take the Gemini two-man spacecraft, put it on a rocket of sorts. I don't know why you have the wings on it there in the lunar atmosphere. It kind of looks like no lunar atmosphere at all. So there we are. We can't wait to see our home planet again from moon orbit with human eyes on it. What I find, Marty, when we look back on the Apollo program and the lunar module, what really strikes me very strongly, and I'm going to advance to these pictures here. There's the big chart. Thank you, Hyatt, for sponsoring us as we look at this space age scene of the way it was going to be. Nothing has topped the exploits of Apollo engineers in my mind. They took something complicated, particularly the lunar module, and made it very, very purposeful, and the only once manned spacecraft still in outer space. All right, all the other lunar modules that ascent stages either crashed into the moon. Apollo 9's was sent into the Pacific Ocean, I believe, and maybe the Indian Ocean, and all they're either crashed in the moon, in our ocean, or in a museum. All of our crewed spacecraft that America has launched into space. But nothing has topped what I think the Grumman engineers have done over 50 years ago. They had a deadline to meet, they had a weight restriction to meet, and they had so many unknowns to meet. And this test of Apollo 10, I'm telling you, as a teenager 50 years ago, was so exciting to live through. You couldn't find out much information about it, Marty. You had to go to the library and get the space flight news, not space flight news, Air and Space Museum, other things like that. I always tell people that the only, what was the Twitter of the day? How could you get the most accurate information as quickly as possible there, Robert Law in Scotland? Think about that for a minute. What was the Twitter of the day when we had the AM, a morning newspaper, an evening newspaper? We had Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report were weeklies that condensed the news. And then there were other trade magazines like Aviation Weekly, and that they called Aviation Leakly, because a lot of leaks in the industry came out. What was the Twitter of the day? AM radio. That was where all the great music was in the 60s. They didn't move that rock and roll to FM until about 72, 73. But all the music was on the AM stations. And at the top of the hour and bottom of the hour, they always had newscasts. So that was your Twitter of the day. Some radio stations had news every 20 minutes, so 3 times an hour. And that's how you would find out if the astronauts were performing a spacewalk or was a success. And all that based on what NASA was feeding the news services. So, to take the Grumman Lunar Module to 9 miles of the surface, and then there were still some problems on the Apollo 11. In fact, they didn't work out the gravity of the moon, and that caused a gravitational lumps on the surface, created the Apollo 11 to be 3 miles off their targeted area. But that was fixed with a pinpoint landing in November '69, when Apollo 12 landed right next to the Surveyor spacecraft that landed unmanned a year and a half earlier. So, but what I find very fascinating, that once we do go back to the moon, Grumman built 12 lunar modules, and it is the only spacecraft still ever built designed to travel humans to another world in the void of outer space and blast off that alien world and come back to another safe spacecraft to return to Earth. And Marty, every bit of it was built by hand. Okay, and when we go back to the moon, about half of it's going to be 3D printed, I guarantee you, and if not most of it. Okay, but think about that, a hand-built moon machine that worked, and we're so grateful for those Grumman workers that are in our community here on the Space Coast, and a lot of them live in the Long Island area where Bethpage was the city that Grumman's headquarters were. And if you see one, you ought to shake their hand and say thank you for taking us to the moon. Marty knows I've got a lot of his friends that I love seeing, and I pump them every time about some of the lunar module work that they did. So hope you've enjoyed our little program here on Apollo 10 with a heavy emphasis on the Grumman Lunar Module, the only spacecraft ever built to operate in the void of outer space with humans standing up, landing on an alien world, and then blasting off that alien world successfully. So, Marty, I thank you for all you've done today, particularly what you did to get us to the moon 53 years ago. We'll never forget it. And tomorrow we'll talk some more Stay Curious news about shuttle history, and there's a couple other items in space history that we'll talk about, and maybe an astronaut birthday or two. Until I see you again, I'm Mark Marquette, and I hope to see you in our museum soon to bridge the space between us.